Hello, I'm Felicity Minch. This program is about a Carnegie Library, its history, how it changed with changing times, and how it's being used today. Andrew Carnegie funded many of these library buildings across America, which helped to create a system of free public libraries.
On Friday, May 11, 2012, an open house was held at the old 1912 Carnegie Library building in Longmont, Colorado, to celebrate its 100th anniversary. Notables attending were the present town mayor and former city mayors amid the throng that filled the building with visitors. The 1912 building houses facilities for local origination TV programming for Channel 8 in Longmont. It's had that use since about 1998. Today, the old structure contains upgraded modern high-tech gadgetry of high-definition television and live video web streaming. The facility provides TV coverage of city council and school board meetings, along with other events. It had been used as a library until the summer of 1972, when the east wing of a new library had been built to the east. The new library wing, built along with a new civic center called Project 75, was intended to be expandable with a knockout wall. It could have been expanded to the west on ground occupied by the 1912 Carnegie Building to create a much larger structure. The addition of a second floor could have also expanded the size of the newer library as it had been proposed. An architectural model shows what had been planned for a 1970s expansion, but only the east wing was completed and then would be demolished during the summer of 1992. In 1972, the Carnegie Library building was only 60 years old. Removing it in 1972 for a new library may have seemed like a more acceptable plan, but in 1992, the building was 80 years old and the thinking about historic preservation had changed. By then, the city had designated many historic landmark buildings and created 2 national historic districts. Steel magnate Andrew Carnegie had been influenced by industrialist Peter Cooper, benefactor of the Cooper Union in New York City. Cooper created a trade school where anyone could receive a free education. Carnegie followed that example, funding construction of 2,509 libraries throughout the English-speaking world. Of these, 1,679 were built in the United States. While Carnegie believed wealth in the hands of a few was needed to sustain a democracy, he also believed the wealthy should pay back the society that enabled them to gain wealth. Carnegie was largely self-taught from books he borrowed from Colonel James Anderson. Anderson had a small library of books which he loaned to local boys on Saturday afternoons. Carnegie had worked long hours in hard jobs as a youth with no access to education. He believed boys and girls needed free access to books to educate themselves and should share cultural opportunities on a basis of equality. Since he had been born in Scotland in 1835, he also believed free libraries gave immigrants a way to acquire a cultural knowledge of America. Carnegie believed he who dies rich dies disgraced, and he wrote a gospel of wealth that would influence other philanthropy. Boulder and Longmont, throughout their histories, engaged in spirited competitiveness, which appears evident in their establishment of Carnegie Libraries. Boulder acquired a $15,000 grant from the Carnegie Foundation on February 20, 1904. The idea received enthusiastic community support and led to construction of a Carnegie Library at 1125 Pine Street, which commenced in 1906. Just 1 year later, the facility was open and boasted a collection of 3,000 books. Not to be outdone, determined Longmonters created a library board by ordinance on March 12, 1907, and also applied for a Carnegie grant. The foundation promised the city $12,500 on December 13, 1907. Longmont only had a WCTU reading room at the time, which replaced the town's old library hall. It had been one of the oldest libraries established in Colorado. Ironically, efforts to build a new library were thwarted by a Donnybrook over where to locate the edifice. Its funding was clouded by a controversial tax issue when the proposal was put to a public vote on June 30, 1908. As a result, the Carnegie Library proposition was voted down by Longmont voters by a margin of 225 to 75. Another ballot issue pertained to its location. Some key local citizens, including the architect, thought it should be placed in Thompson Park, named after Library Hall's benefactor, Elizabeth Thompson. But this idea lost by a margin of 100 to 55 to a ballot option to place the Carnegie Library structure near City Hall. The Carnegie grant mainly covered the cost of a building. The grant stipulated that the city would have to provide a site and $1,250 or 10% per annum for maintenance. The city government then began allocating $1,500 annually toward a fund to help begin the effort. An option on a parcel of land comprised of the first 3 lots of Block 65 at 4th Avenue and Kimbark Street was secured after a fundraiser produced $100 each from about 14 generous citizens. After donations were made, the land was purchased for $2,000. The May 31, 1912 deed transferred ownership. With political issues settled, a contract to build the Carnegie Library structure was awarded to Sprague and Wiggins for $12,551, as reported in the August 16, 1912 Longmont Ledger. There are some notable similarities and differences between the Boulder and Longmont Carnegie Libraries. Both buildings were made from a light-colored brick. Longmont architect Benjamin C. Viney served as supervising architect on the Boulder project for architect Thomas McLaurin from Colorado Springs during its construction in 1906 to 1907. Viney later designed the Longmont Library for its 1912 completion, a design likely influenced by guidelines issued by the Carnegie Foundation in 1911. Viney also supervised construction of a library in Roswell, New Mexico for McLaurin. The layout of the Longmont Carnegie building is of a more utilitarian design that closely resembles plans from Notes on Library Buildings provided as minimum standards for Carnegie structures. The standards were provided because some communities erected buildings of poor quality or inefficient design. The document stated that many of the buildings erected years ago from plans tacitly permitted at the time would not be allowed now. The earlier Boulder structure was designed by architect Thomas McLaurin prior to the Carnegie guidelines. He patterned it after a small Greek temple that was unearthed the year before. The driving force for this was likely the immense popularity of neoclassical styles after the 1893 Columbian Exposition. Boulderites of the time called their community the Athens of the West. This was a reflection of the popular 19th century notion that the Greek model of society was one to be emulated and a classical education was the primary sign of an educated man. This likely caused Greek revival elements to be included in the bolder Carnegie structure. But the thrifty old Scotsman, Andrew Carnegie, criticized a number of recipients for building Greek temples. His office correspondence reveals some views about the library designs. Carnegie's chief aide, James Bertram, another Scotsman, wrote a letter to Belleville, New Jersey officials. Bertram's letter stated, "The architect states that your building is of monumental design with a large amount of granite steps. It is, in fact, a monument and not a library building at all." Carnegie wrote a letter to Denver officials saying their library design had too many pillars. Librarians of the time appeared to be at odds with architects over the issue of efficient designs. At a meeting in 1888, the American Library Association president, Charles Cutter, retorted that the architect was the natural enemy of the librarian. The issue generated much discussion at conferences, but the strong resurgence of the neoclassical styles prevailed. At a 1903 meeting of the Illinois Library Association, the paradox was revealed and stated, "To submit a design in any other style is practically fatal to an architect's chances." The Longmont Carnegie building could be of importance due to its efficient, simplistic design. The Boulder Library plan is rectangular with a short facade, and it has its main entrance on the left side. The Longmont Library, in contrast, is a rectangular plan with a long facade which has a central bay facade entrance. The Longmont Library more closely resembles recommended 1911 Carnegie layouts. Longmont's library's layout is similar to structures built in Green River, Wyoming, and in the cities of Florence, Idaho Springs, Lamar, and Trinidad in Colorado. The exterior appearance of these buildings varies, and Carnegie libraries were often unique. Quite possibly, all of the structures are designs that were one of a kind. The first thing that is stated in the Statement of Significance in the National Registry form of the Boulder Library is, "The Carnegie Library is significant because of its association with Andrew Carnegie and the National Library movement that he supported. This is possibly the most important consideration. Careful study is needed." Carnegie libraries in places like Delta in Colorado and in the West were often backed by women's groups. The Longmont Carnegie Library was rated a Category 3 structure in a 1975 study. It was listed in a 1984 downtown area architectural survey and was rated a building of primary importance in a 1988 City Landmark Commission prioritization process. The building had been completed toward the end of 1912, and as reported in the December 27th issue of the weekly Longmont Ledger newspaper. That was about 8 months after the tragic sinking of the Titanic ocean liner in the North Atlantic. The Longmont Carnegie Library opened in early 1913 as reported in the January 31, 1913 issue of the Ledger. The newspaper had a photograph of the Carnegie Library, almost completed, featured in the December 13, 1912 issue.
Longmont's Carnegie Library was much celebrated back when it was built in 1912, and it served as the town's public library for 60 years. But it was a much different situation by 1992, when the building faced moving or demolition for a new library expansion project. The City Landmarks Commission at the time was caught in the middle of the drama.
It put us at odds with the city council we were supposed to serve as an advisory board, but we were appointed to give them expert advice.
Yeah, there were council people and there were obviously staff that were working against the preservation rules.
everybody has to follow the rules. Whatever the city ordinances are and the state statutes, everybody follow those, including the commissions.
Almost every city council vote on the Carnegie was a split decision, with various factions having opinions that differed. About all we could do was uphold the existing city preservation ordinance and establish city policies.
We were able to see this whole, I would call it a drama, unfold, because we're there every week videotaping it.
Removal of historic buildings was not consistent with goal number 4 of the city's comprehensive plan or with City Ordinance number 1112 of 1971 or with City Ordinance 1450 of 1976. From the start, Chapter 2.56 of the City Municipal Code had created a process to protect and preserve areas of historic, architectural, or geographic importance. The ordinance had been updated in 1983, and at the end of Section 2.56.010 about purpose, it stated, "It is the opinion of the City Council that the economic, cultural, and aesthetic standing of this city cannot be maintained or enhanced by disregarding the historical, architectural, and geographic heritage of this city and by ignoring the destruction or defacement of such cultural assets." Longmont had become a certified local government, or CLG, which gave it a special importance and funding status for grants. It was important to preserve that reputation with the state by the proper management of historic buildings. One part of proper management in this case was specified by the Secretary of the Interior's Standards for Rehabilitation, which had been adopted by the City Council as part of the CLG agreement. The standards advised against the moving of historic buildings. Another concern was the possibility of the Carnegie Building being eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. This might have had an impact on federal funding programs because of the city's memorandum of agreement with the state office pertaining to the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. It had been signed by a former city mayor in 1985. Certain federal laws may also apply to the use of federal money in projects that would deface or destroy a site eligible for the National Register. The St. Vrain Historical Society was also concerned, as they had wanted a city historic preservation policy and process established in 1971. By 1990, the 1972 library wing, built along with Project 75, was badly in need of more space. The planned expansion had not happened, and the 1912 Carnegie Building was being used for city offices. Andrew Carnegie desired that certain conditions be met. One of these conditions was that the city allocate 10% of the grant amount per annum for building maintenance. Another condition was that a Carnegie Library was intended only for specific uses. In some cases, where a Carnegie building was sold, the Carnegie Corporation asked that the proceeds be applied to a new library structure. They also asked that a tablet or plaque be attached to a new structure citing the original building and its donor. Municipal offices were often placed in the buildings. The Carnegie Corporation asked the state librarian to remove offices from the library basement at Upland, California. They also protested non-library uses in the basement of the Etowah, Tennessee Library when it was being used for a city recorder's office and high school classes. The Carnegie Corporation notified the library trustees at Bolivar, New York, that not even the town council should be allowed to use library space for meetings. Alexandria, Minnesota asked the Carnegie Corporation about a request to use a lecture room for music club meetings or Christian Science church services, and they replied that the rooms were to be used only for lectures directly supplementary to library work. Humboldt, Iowa requested temporary use of their library lecture room for high school classes to help alleviate overcrowding, but it was turned down. The Carnegie Corporation also protested to officials over misuse of an upstairs lecture hall at the Jefferson, Texas Library, which was being used as an opera house and a motion picture theater. The original old building often wasn't a concern if a free public-supported library was continued. In Longmont, the expansion of the Project 75 library wing that then existed was put to Longmont voters in the form of a $14 million bond issue in the city election of 1991. Passage of the funding allowed a new library project to move forward, but the architects hired by the city proposed a totally new library structure that abandoned the Project 75 design. The new architects engaged for the new library expansion presented several new design options. This would turn into a mess some called Library Gate. One city council member claimed no one stepped forward from the City Landmarks Commission on the Carnegie early in the process, but the facts were that the Landmarks Commission identified the Carnegie Building as a structure of primary importance in a historic resources priority listing document that had been published in 1990. Copies were reportedly distributed to the City Council and to other officials in the city government. The Civic Center expansion first appeared on the Landmark Commission agendas as an informational item in early 1991. Discussions resulted in a memo that was sent to the Council for their March 10, 1991 packets. This memo listed the historic buildings in the vicinity of the proposed library expansion schemes. A follow-up letter was also sent to the Council, dated April 16, 1991, that again listed the buildings of concern, which included the Carnegie Library at the top of the list. The Commission chairman spoke at a Council meeting when Plan A2 proposed moving 10 old buildings along Main Street and asked them for an environmental impact assessment. After Plans A2 and C were scrapped and Plan B2 was adopted by Council, the Landmark Commission was given an initial presentation of the project. A spokesman for the architects attended a Landmarks Commission meeting in July of 1991. 3 councilmen and the deputy city manager also attended this meeting. The keyhole design for the library was discussed at the time, which proposed building a new structure around the existing Carnegie building. This design gave the city the option of keeping the 1912 Carnegie building as an architectural jewel in the keyhole notch area or ripping it down for a pocket park. Preservationists did not want the Carnegie building moved or demolished. They wanted more design ideas that included the Carnegie structure and asked that a reason be given why the Carnegie could not be included in the development. The architect's representative stated that he felt the Carnegie could be retained on site, but no good reasons for its removal or other design ideas would ever emerge. In a July 27, 1991 newspaper story, the architects were quoted as stating, "The Carnegie could fit into plans, but this article also said some of the city council expressed doubts." The architects' representatives state that the Carnegie could be raised or offered to the private sector for removal. In an August 9, 1991 newspaper article, another spokesman for the architects claimed the Carnegie doesn't fit into the plans. The architect stated that the building would cost $250,000 to rehabilitate and could be moved for about $30,000. In January of 1992, at the request of the city's Landmark Commission, the city's planning office studied the cost to remove the old Carnegie Library, which produced estimates ranging from $42,000 to $225,000 for the building move alone. Cost estimates would vary widely throughout the process. A story in the newspaper on January 19, 1994, would list moving bids ranging from $42,000 to $500,000. This same story cited a Nebraska company who claimed they could do the moving to another site in the Old Town area for about $130,000. A local mover estimated that it would cost between $185,000 to $225,000, not including asbestos removal. An August 14, 1991 newspaper story titled "Design Draws City OK" reported the City Council decision to adopt the keyhole design. But some had the opinion the Carnegie didn't carry enough historical weight to build a new library around it. The local historical society president spoke at the meeting saying, "We are concerned about what this decision reflects in terms of the city's commitment to historic preservation in general." Longmont's Carnegie Library had a sign over the front door in the 1980s identifying the building as the City Hall Annex. It was used for a variety of city offices until being vacated for the 1992 Civic Center expansion project. Amid the controversy about keeping it on site, the City Landmark Commission members inspected the building themselves at the time and found it to be in sturdy shape. Some critics at meetings claimed that it was crumbling. The Landmarks Commission chairman did more research on the Carnegie building and wrote a report dated September 7, 1991. This report was sent to the Colorado Historical Society State Office, along with a letter that asked for a reassessment of the National Register eligibility. They responded with a letter that indicated it would qualify for the National Register of Historic Places Criteria C due to its age, style, and unaltered condition. This letter and the September 7, 1991 report titled Longmont's Carnegie Library, an Historical Assessment and Adaptive Use Proposal were then forwarded to Council. This resulted in a joint meeting between the Landmark Designation Commission and the City Council on October 15, 1991, where the Carnegie Library matter was discussed for about 2 hours. An article in the newspaper on the following day titled Council Shelves Carnegie reported a vote by the City Council taken at that meeting to suspend their move or demolish decision. The Daily Times Call article reported that the Council's decision to wait means the municipal library might still be expanded around the Carnegie building. The Carnegie building's historical standing seemed to sway most council members away from their earlier position. But at the meeting, some rhetoric was also expressed in opposition to keeping the Carnegie. The library board chairman stated that the Carnegie stood in the way of a new library. The library director claimed it was too much of an administrative burden. A spokesman for the architect claimed a rehabilitation of the Carnegie could cost up to $500,000 requiring custom milled woodwork. It was twice the amount that they had stated previously. The issue of different floor-level heights and handicapped accessibility was also discussed as a major problem. The architect stated that if the Carnegie structure was to remain, they would prefer that it not be connected to the new library. It was also disclosed at the meetings that they would prefer to saw the southeast corner off of the Carnegie building to facilitate open space for a grandiose keyhole atrium that was proposed for the development. The architects did, however, state the Carnegie could be kept in with the design of the new library and that the only major change to the design would be the treatment of the exterior walls in the keyhole atrium corner to presumably help hide the blunder of wanting to remove the building for something as insipid as a courtyard. The idea was trumpeted that the Carnegie space was needed for library programming needs that included an outdoor reading room, model rocket launching, and skateboarding. Other ideas that had been proposed for the Carnegie Library space were an amphitheater and an ice skating rink. The Carnegie Library was discussed again in a study session on December 10th, as reported in a Daily Times Call story the following day titled, Carnegie to Move for Project. The city manager and his deputy then rushed a council communication for a consent agenda item for the next council meeting on December 17th, which stated, Staff recommends that the Carnegie Library will be relocated or demolished. Funding for the renovation and reuse of the building for city functions does not exist. The council was asked to table the item, saying there was no reason to rush a decision on the Carnegie, but only one person in attendance spoke in opposition. After a short discussion, the City Council then voted in favor of the staff recommendation 3-2 with 2 members absent. The city offered to sell the Carnegie Library building for $1 to anyone willing to move it. The city would throw in $30,000 for moving costs, but no one fell for the idea. A newspaper article on May 14, 1992, titled "Carnegie Hall's Little Relocation Support," reported that few people wanted to serve on the relocation committee being proposed. The ones who were knowledgeable about historic buildings did not want to participate in any mismanagement of the structure.
With the lack of support for preserving the Longmont Carnegie Library, a citizens group was being formed to do what the city government itself was not able to achieve. And a petition drive was being organized to present an alternative proposal that had public support.
In April of 1992, a coalition was organized named CORE, Citizens Opposed to Removal of Public Structures, to work toward preservation of the Carnegie Library in its present location. A nomination to list the building in the National Register of Historic Places was submitted to the State Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation in Denver on May 9th. Since Longmont was a CLG certified local government, the Landmark Commission voted unanimously on June 4, 1992, that the building is eligible for listing in the National Register under Criterion A and C. The City Council, however, decided to send a letter to the Colorado Historical Society in opposition to the nomination. Since the Carnegie Library was a publicly owned structure, the nomination went forward because it had been approved by the Commission. If it was privately owned, the nomination would have gone forward for a determination of eligibility only. The question asking for an opinion about this went all the way to Washington, D.C. The State Historic Preservation Review Board voted unanimously to recommend listing the Longmont Carnegie Library in the National Register, as reported in a July 18, 1992 newspaper story titled "A Landmark Decision," and the nomination went forward. The National Register of Historic Places was basically created to encourage preservation. An editorial in the Daily Times Call of July 26, 1992, was prophetic in its prediction. In the piece titled, "It Looks Like One Library Will Survive," the newspaper wrote that the National Park Service would likely approve the old Carnegie Library nomination, placing the building in with an elite group of a few other notable landmarks in town. They wrote that the City Council had only 2 choices: destroy a national landmark or incorporate the Carnegie into the Civic Center project. The Longmont Carnegie was listed in the National Register as reported in a Daily Times Call story on December 8, 1992. A petition drive in October for an ordinance by initiative to keep the building on site and designate it a local landmark had been successful. But the City Council voted in December to put the issue on the ballot in November of 1993, delaying action by almost a year. A November 15, 1992 story in the Denver Post by the longtime urban environment columnist Joanne Dittmer appeared titled, "Longmont Learns Not to Ignore Public." It cited results of the petition drive where 3,674 signatures were gathered in only 20 days, where only 2,628 were needed. Dittmer gave a summary of the effort, writing, "Pity town decision-makers who aren't aware of or ignore the loyalty that citizens have toward their historic public landmarks. Longmont officials tried to ignore it and are learning the public won't be ignored." But some of the city council didn't seem to learn much from the petition, and they formed a task force to study costs. A report that claimed rehab costs would be $439,000 to $652,000 and annual operating costs could be $100,000 for the Carnegie building was released prior to the election. The Carnegie initiative failed by 62 votes, less than 1%, in the November 2, 1993 election, but it passed in 2 of 3 city wards and was supported by 4,756 voters, drawing 49.68% of the vote. The core group ordered a recount, which was completed on November 8th. It produced the same numbers, but it revealed that some ballots had been issued incorrectly in the outlying precincts. The initiative lost in those areas which included voters who lived inside and outside the city limits. Only voters who live inside the city limits were eligible to vote on city issues. The voter registration accuracy was unknown, and 926 of the ballots were left blank. One city councilman said, "The voters have spoken," but it was not clear what a no vote meant, as some said they voted against restricting the use as proposed in the election ballot question. The city had also sent out information to the voters prior to the election at taxpayer expense in a booklet titled, "Get the Facts So You Can Vote Wisely." But facts like the building being funded by Andrew Carnegie and listed in the National Register were omitted or submerged, as were grant funding possibilities that existed for the building renovation. After the November 1993 election, there was some turnover in the city council. The new city council members formed another task force by a 4-3 vote to study Carnegie costs as reported in a December 22, 1993 newspaper story. The story claimed that asbestos abatement, demolition of the Carnegie building, and creation of a park at the site would only cost $60,000. This was hard to believe when the demolition of the Project 75 library wing had cost $249,553, as had been reported in a July 20, 1992 newspaper story. Some of the reported costs did not make sense, and this raised a red flag that something was wrong somewhere.
One thing that may have acted in favor of saving the Longmont's old Carnegie Library was the unexpected demolition of the Project 75 wing of the existing library for construction of the new building. From the architect's drawings and plans, it seemed clear to some what would be happening, but this was apparently not well understood as the plot thickened.
Demolition of this Project 75 library wing appeared to be a total surprise to the City Council in the summer of 1992. A large crowd was at the council meeting afterward, expressing outrage. Armed police were even there in case things got out of hand. Stories appeared in the newspaper, one titled, "Raising Stirs Up History," and an editorial titled, "At least they blew the horn for Jericho," reported that one nervous city council member had said, "I wonder what other surprises are out there." The city council member made the remark in reaction to assurances the designers had given them that the renovation would cause no displacement. The editorial went on to say, "Surprise, the library's gone." It reported that a self-anointed committee consisting of the new library designers, a private project manager, the deputy city manager, the library director, and other city staff members had decided in March to remove the Project 75 library building without consulting their bosses on the city council. The editorial went on to say, had voters known the library building was unsuitable for remodeling, the project and even the election itself might have taken on a new complexion. It reported the council ordered an explanation of how a public structure can be destroyed without the council's consent or the public's knowledge. The newspaper went on to question, "It's making us wonder what other surprises are out there."
We saw firsthand the uproar when that building came down. And frankly, it was shocking to all of us to drive by that site and look and see basically an elevator shaft.
Folks in the business community in downtown Longmont were livid when they woke up one morning and the library was in rubble. The only thing standing was the elevator shaft.
Mayor Wilson and some of the rest of us on council were very upset and angry with the city manager's office for tearing down that Ames wing of the built in 1975, Project 75. So the library that they tore down to make room for the new one, they were using the same thinking as the ones that were trying to tear down our Carnegie Library, and council became very angry. I think some heads rolled over that issue.
It came out that a demolition permit was not issued. It came out in a series of newspaper stories titled Libraries Fall Plotted in March on July 3rd, one titled Library Fell Before Permitted on July 13th, and one titled City Knew It Would Fall on August 28th. The cost to demolish the east wing of the Project 75 library structure had come out in a newspaper story on July 20th, 1992. The story reported that it cost almost the $250,000 to demolish the library wing they had built for $446,359 in the early 1970s. It also came out in the July 20th article that the city had budgeted $340,143 to move the library contents to a mall location on the north end of town during construction. A story in the July 2nd, 1992 newspaper had the caption, "Designer Defends Old Building." The architect of the Project 75 library wing criticized the demolition of the structure he had designed that was only 20 years old. The newspaper quoted him as saying, "I don't really understand what they are trying to do. This was built to be a 100-year-old building. It implies that I did not do what was required." Newspapers in nearby cities caught on to the brouhaha. A July 14th story in the Boulder Daily Camera titled, "Raising Library Raises Fuss in Longmont." A story in the Denver Post titled, "Raising of Library Raises Hackles" appeared on August 7th, and another one titled, "Longmont Misused Funds" would appear in the Denver Post on October 5th. The story headline said, "Library Blunder Typical of City Management," and it reported that a recall group had been formed to oust 4 city council members for misusing money. It also said the group had filed a fraud complaint with the State Securities Commission. They complained that voters had been misled on the scope of the cost of the $17 million Civic Center expansion and renovation. All of the fallout from the library flap drew a crowd, and it resulted in the resignation of the city manager and his deputy in the rather shabby episode that would become called Library Gate. It seemed remarkable that people were still talking about demolition of the Carnegie building after demolition of the Project 75 library wing touched off a powder keg.
The Longmont Carnegie Library had the National Register listing, but was also designated as a local historic landmark in 1995, as had been proposed in the election ballot initiative. The building was renovated with grants, and it became studios for local origination TV programming.
The National Register listing had established the historical importance of the Carnegie Building very well. The city election had clearly demonstrated that keeping it garnered virtually 50% of the vote. A fight over the Carnegie could have been avoided if the council had adopted the ordinance by initiative presented in the petition. The election of 1993 made changes to the city council. A task force to study moving the Carnegie in December had only garnered 2 applicants. This showed little interest in it being moved, and few in town appeared to want it destroyed. One of the movers who asked to give an estimate on moving the old Carnegie was quoted in a January 7, 1994 newspaper story as saying, "It would save a whole lot of hassle and money if everyone would just shut up and let it set where it is. You've got a bunch of bureaucratic giants down there with no brains."
Don't agree with that concept of moving it, selling it to someone, and privatizing the building. It's better kept in the public venue.
That structure should remain where it was at 4th and Kimbark. It is a piece of Longmont's history, and it needed to remain. And the fact that there was any consideration to removing it, to me, is just it's a travesty.
The Carnegie Building was ultimately kept on site by a 4-3 vote by the council in February of 1994. Longmont's 1912 Carnegie Library still stands amid the taller library structure built in the early 1990s. It remains in the keyhole notch with the newer structure wrapped around it. Some critics say the back of the Carnegie is ugly and an eyesore when viewed from the new library windows. These visual issues may need more work and study to remedy well as the town moves forward.
The organization, Citizens Opposed to Removal of Public Structures, or CORE, they were a passionate group of people who expressed their point of view and got things done. And I think we were successfully chosen as the occupant, partly because of the sentiment of the community at the time that helped save the building. But I think that we were a good fit for people who found value in historic buildings. I think those kinds of people tend to find value in community television that brings them community parades and high school football games and city council meetings and school board meetings, community documentaries, coverage of art and music. So the people that valued that building, I think, tended to value the organization, the Longmont Cable Trust, and it just seemed to work very well together.
I'm really proud to be part of, to my knowledge, the first groundswell citizens group who lobbied City Council vigorously to change a course of action. But I think it brought together a number of people from various political backgrounds who all were united.
This was in a sense a coup d'état to preserve what turned out to be a very valuable resource in our community. Right now, there's a Channel 8 TV station there, and also K-Good, our small local radio station located in that building. So it's used very well.
I would agree. I think the use of it by Channel 3, now Channel 8, is totally appropriate for a literary structure. They've done such a nice job of refurbishing it.
We needed to participate in raising the funds for the renovation and the remodeling to suit our needs. The project was going to approach $270,000, and we did receive a grant from the State Historical Society in the amount of about $180,000, $185,000. The City of Longmont had both cash and in-kind contributions. The cable company donated money. CORE, the Citizens Opposed to Removal of Public Structures, they held some fundraisers and they donated some money. Then also the community development block grants. So by bringing together funds from all these different organizations, it was like once you got one thing, then the next one would come.
Boulder acquired a $15,000 grant from the Carnegie Foundation.
I'm Marsley Grollup, and I was library director of the Boulder Public Library from 66 to 2003. Well, I worked at the Boulder Public Library from 59 to 63, and we were in the old Carnegie building in the 80s and 90s. We did 2 or 3 renovations. By that point, it was landmarked. The outside you really can't do anything to, but we didn't want to wreck the inside either. Parks and Recreation Department had used it for a senior center for a while, and they just used it for storage. And they didn't close the building because it was too dangerous for anybody to be in it. The floor was all nailed up with shuffleboard courts, and you could still see where they were, but we pulled all that stuff off and refinished the floors. It's got the same windows, and it's got the same floor, and it's got the same layout, and we just added some space. We got some money from the city, we got some money from the Library Foundation, and then this woman gave us the endowment for the oral history, and we got some grants, some historical grants to renovate it. I had to fight like hell to get it back after we left it, and now everybody's glad. Somebody wanted to make a restaurant out of it, somebody else wanted to do something else with it, and I was just fighting the hell out of them because I said we need to keep the building, and we need to put our historical collection in there and build it from there. And finally I got enough council people that were willing to do that. I really had these big fights and arguments, probably the better part of a year. And the Library Foundation was generous enough to say that they'd give us a lot of the money to fix it up so it really wouldn't cost the city anything except for the staff. Fortunately, I knew a lot of people on council, and that was the time we had 5 women and 4 men. The women were more interested in it than the men were, and we won finally. The Library Commission was on my side on that one, and the city manager wasn't, but I got enough council people. Of course, now they're really pleased that they kept it, because a library director's real job is to serve the citizens of the community and build a library that does that well. You know, it always takes something good being torn down to finally get people aroused enough that they start wanting to save things. And I think you just have to have people that have some imagination and know that old buildings are, you know, you have these limitations because it's a public building. But there is no reason why a public building can't be a practical library building, but a beautiful building, that you can make it that way.
What kind of a statement does our stewardship of the environment say about us? It is the legacy we create for better or for worse. The concept of historic preservation was encouraged by the writings of Sir Walter Scott and the 19th century reformer John Ruskin. In the 1840s, Ruskin first introduced the idea of trusteeship of our heritage. One key concept is the notion of public ownership. In his 1865 book, The Lamp of Memory, Ruskin wrote, "Old buildings are not ours. They belong partly to those who built them and partly to the generations of mankind who are to follow us. The dead still have the right to them. That which they labored for, we have no right to obliterate." Not considering the future has an arrogance, denying the people of the future the right of having an opinion or deciding things for themselves. The City Code Section 2.56 had been written by others many years before the Carnegie controversy. In 1971, citizens thought a preservation process was needed and the commission was created. By 1991, it had been operating for 20 years, establishing a precedent for what had been done. A controversy could have been avoided with more awareness and sensitivity. Saving the Longmont Carnegie Library was an example of the process working and democracy in action as citizens acted to preserve their heritage.
The notion that Andrew Carnegie wanted his name on the buildings he funded is untrue, but he did ask that there should be placed over the entrance of the libraries I build a representation of the rays of the sun, and above, let there be light. Thanks for watching.